The 23 five-sided stars above me remained still, dim in their idleness as their glow had long since burned out. I knew there were 23, because I had counted them again and again in my long hours of solitude, until one would fall out of its synchronized orbit, or rather, off of the roof of my bedroom and onto the floor. 22. The clashing of dishes, the running of water, and the noisy influx of the vacuum could all be heard throughout the house as my sister made her preparations for David's arrival, as though such a dirtbag would really judge her off of such subtle things. Had I been as good at reading her as I could other people, I would have found that her excessive cleaning habits were not done for David at all, but as a nervous habit in reconciling her regrets over the dispute we had only an hour ago. But that was just a distant assumption. I didn't bother to leave my room. Had I even attempted to, Kristen's stern form probably would have been there right outside my door, to make sure fun would not be a part of my day. I was sure she would claim it was because I was suspended, and that such things weren't supposed to be fun at all. But that would be her taking the roundabout way of saying she was still angry at me. Nevertheless, the sudden overwhelming urge to indulge in a fresh air of freedom caused me to plot an escape. I opened the door to my front room, using my personally patented peek hole technique to ensure that the coast was clear. The loud vacuum buffered the creaking sounds of the door that escaped as I opened it just enough to squeeze my narrow frame through. Running through my mind was the script fashion of an excuse I would respond with to my sister if she was ever to catch and question me for leaving my room. Though I highly doubted she would buy it, my idea was to throw on an unconcerned and rather straightforward face as I told her that I was simply out to fetch the pile of homework Dylan had brought over from school. It wouldn't work, that I knew, as I was never a liar, and that excuse was straight up outrageous in terms of stretching the truth. Even my sister knew the gnawing agony of boredom would not cause me to perform any task fit for the word work, and I scrapped the idea in an instant and walked on. I peeked through the stairway rail to see if I could catch a glimpse of my sister, and the wild flowing form of her hair flew into view as she zoomed around the living room with the scarcely used vacuum of ours. She did it with such eagerness that it looked like an exotic workout routine that could guarantee abs in less than 15 seconds a day. And I desperately hoped she'd be longer than that. The moment when I caught view of the back of her, I flew down the stairs without concern for the thumping sound of my feet as my sister had a pair of headphones on that must have been cranked to full capacity just to overcome the volume of the vacuum. She was pretty much deaf to all. As though stripped of the edge from the risk of being caught, I slowed to a walk and proceeded straight to the front door, threw on my shoes, and stepped right out onto the outside porch. My house was way off course from anything that could be considered in tune with society. The driveway alone was near a mile's walk before it escaped the looming shade of the forest that surrounded my home. I swung around to my backyard and cut through into the tree line where a neighboring house was on the other side, which had a much shorter driveway that led into a main road, making it significantly easier for me to reach humanity. The older lady that lived there was a nice one, as she had always allowed me to get off the school bus in front of her house and cut through her yard in order to get to my place. Her name was Mrs. Jankowski, but usually let me call her Mrs. Jan. She tried to talk to me as I got off the bus on nearly every occasion, but I would usually hurry across into my yard as though a sudden and urgent matter needed my attention. It wasn't that I didn't like her, just that, well, she was old. Old people always talked in such a way that I didn't really know how to respond back. That, and they always had a smell to them. It wasn't really bad, but certainly wasn't good. It was a funny smell that each elderly woman had, as though they were using a rare and long expired form of perfume that existed in an era unheard of by most living folks. On top of their original odor, they always had stories that detailed their experience in life, but it was usually fabricated to the point of disbelief. The moral twist at the end of every one of their tales made it feel like I was listening to some terrible kids show that would sacrifice exciting and engaging plot for a lesson on life. I always found the endings too predictable, but then again, everything felt that way to me. A chain rustled in the distance as a solid, muscle-bound creature woke from its slumber at the scent of a living and breathing flesh pop that fell into its yard. Butch stepped outside of his luxury-class doghouse and put his nose to the air to find the origins of the tasty meat. Though I was clearly in his view, he didn't acknowledge me until his nose told me told him that I was the intruding fleshy treat to nibble on. That got him excited, though not in a way that I was looking forward to. Butch ran across the yard with a large, thickly set salivating tongue spinning afront like a prop plane's propeller. A killer instinct was in his eye, and though we had been through this countless times before, he was at it again, and his sharp, aggressive bark caused me to jolt upright, something I could never grow used to. A rippling coil of muscular flesh flowed down his shoulders as his front paws dug up the earth in its feral tread. I stared perfectly still, as I always did when it came to this, waiting for Butch to arrive at a close enough distance so that I could feel his canine instincts. Stop. Butch drove his back legs into the ground and pressed them past his front paws as he fought the forward momentum that brought him closer to me. He kicked and snarled his head back as he placed as much physical effort in ensuring that he'd cover no more ground. When the dog came to a complete stop, I stepped toward him. Good, Butch, I said out loud. I am a friend and only want to pet you. Butch's muscular pit bull frame was rolled over onto its back as he anticipated the most intense rub-down session a human being could offer. I jumped in the air with my hands held high, showing off my great willingness to help a friend in need, and brought them down hard on Butch's muscular chest. With all of Butch's size, I never had to worry about hurting him, and he only seemed happier the rougher I was with him. I swiveled both my hands in opposing directions on the thin-haired, large tummy of the dog, who wreathed around in the dirt with squirming joy. I had missed my dog. He had been my best friend growing up, besides Dylan and all, and after his passing I had asked Father if we could get another. He just looked away, unwilling to look me in the eyes, and told me it was the last thing he needed right then, and I never brought the subject up again. Butch quickly became my friend after that. Even though our ritual greeting sessions always began with him seeing me as a slab of meat that had fallen off of the barbecue, I always forgave him for that, and would give him the much-needed attention he craved for on my way to and from school. Ever since my suspension, I hadn't got to spend my morning sessions waiting for the bus with Butch, and his wide-open eyes and sunken ears told me how much he missed me. Is that you, Derek? Butch and I looked up at the voice to the distance and saw Mrs. Jankowski sitting on the front porch to her house. I usually dreaded having to speak to Mrs. Jankowski, only because I had something better to do, like meet up with Dylan, catch one of my favorite television shows, or, most of all, continue with one of my PlayStation games. Nothing got in the way of that, but since I really couldn't play with Dylan and didn't want to be anywhere near my sister at the moment, I didn't actually mind having to talk to Mrs. Jankowski, if it came to that. Butch sat upright as I unleashed him from a very large chain and kept him at bay, and then grabbed onto his collar with two outstretched arms that struggled to hold on. I only did that because Mrs. Jankowski was going to ask me to bring him inside anyways, and the pit bull nearly dragged me across the entire yard until it reached her. I didn't know how an elderly lady like her managed to bring in such a colossal dog, but something told me she had a bag of tasty doggy bones hidden behind the front door that made Butch very eager to come in when asked. Derek, you're the only one that Butch ever let him get that close to him, you know, Mrs. Jankowski started off in her storytelling voice. She looked down with a slight smile and deep, dark blue eyes that completed her silvery hair. The dog and I were busy panting at the bottom end of the stairs to the porch as our bodies recovered from the struggle of control we fought over just moments ago. You two are just so good together. I began rubbing Butch's head with one hand while nervously holding on to his collar with the other. I wasn't exactly sure how obedient the dog was at staying still and didn't want him to take off again with me towed behind. I think both of you deserve a treat. Our tongues quickly rolled out of our mouths, and the two of us, both on all fours, crawled behind Mrs. Jankowski as she led us into the door. I had never actually been in her house before, and it felt a little strange, like every aspect of an elderly person did. I mean, granted, she was old, but man, did this place feel ancient, as though all the furniture and everything among it sat unmoved for centuries. Dust collected in the corners of the room, and old antique glasses held colonies of infantile spiders that burst forth from small cobweb nests. Mrs. Jan pulled out a chair for me and then reached for a cabinet door above the countertop. I slowly eased myself into the small wooden chair that was created at a time when people weren't plump full of supersized value meals, and I worried that its integrity would be unable to even hold my 90-pound butt. She had retrieved 2 jars from the cabinet and placed them with a loud clap on the top of the table, as she was unable to hold on to the solid glass cylinders for long. Butch's eager eyes pointed at the pile of bones that were in the closest jar, while I sat with a drooping jaw at the pile of cookies in the other. I didn't know what era these cookies were originally made in, but chances were they were long past stale, but that wouldn't stop me. Everyone knew old people's cookies were the best, no matter how far past expiration they were. Butch and I settled in fine with our treats as Mrs. Jankowski sat back and watched our enjoyment in the feast. She was satisfied with the idea that she could make others happy and found joy in serving us in what way she could. "How come I haven't been seeing you going off to school, Derek?" asked Mrs. Jan around the time I had consumed my fourth cookie. "The schools give you another week vacation, did they? Oh, how we never had them in my days." "No, Dylan is still going to school," I told her. She was all too familiar with my companion, as he too had to trudge through her backyard with the bravado of facing down Butch on the way to my house. Even after I managed to calm the hound, Dylan would never get too close to the drooling canine. "I just got in some trouble," I said with a bit of modesty. "Oh my. Well, don't tell your sister I was giving you cookies." "She wouldn't be too happy with me then," Mrs. Jan chuckled. "She wouldn't care. She's too busy with her new boyfriend." "Oh, is that right? She doesn't give you any attention anymore?" "No, she does. It's just she's always angry about something, and he's a real butthole." Mrs. Jan let out a jolly laugh as she leaned back in her chair. The creak in the furniture, his old wooden leg gave warning to his struggle. "There will always be one, darling. She will see through him soon enough." "I hope so," I said, placing my half-eaten cookie on a napkin. My loss of appetite occurred the moment I had mentioned David. I really want to beat him up. "Oh, darling. Now don't go off doing something you're going to regret. Your sister wouldn't want that now." Mrs. Jan shared her wisdom. "Your sister would never want any harm to come to you." I held the left side of my face, feeling the slight abrasion on the surface. I nearly hoped it was true. Her love for me was going to be needed in the coming hours, as I would have no choice but to face down David myself. "I think he wants to hurt her," I whispered, releasing my thoughts impulsively. "Is that right? That is sweet of you, Derek, to be concerned for your sister. But she has her own strengths, and they will do their part." Mrs. Jankowski leaned in, placing a finger under my chin to lift my eyes into hers. She looked into the two swirling irises, each their own distinctive color. "You have deep eyes, child, and in those depths are wisdom. Tell her your concerns. People will always listen to your concerns, Derek. They can see your caring nature." "Not her," I said. "She's not like other people." "She never hears my words," I whispered. Butch had willingly followed me back into the yard, and I leashed the large chain back onto his collar, as I waved goodbye to Mrs. Jankowski. I slid back through the short tree line that divided our yards and made my way towards home. There was another car in the driveway, and I knew precisely who drove it. The pool was silent, and the surface of the water sat untouched. Normally I'd give in to its harmonious call and dive through its surface and swim among its sanctioned depths, but the water was not safe to drink when predators were on the prowl. It was the foundation of liberty, my sense of freedom, but it was forfeit, until the beast on the land had been dealt with. I climbed the wooden stairs that led into the backyard screened house porch, where an old unused grill and pool toys sat in an unbundled mess. The glass door to the house was shut, and I placed my hands on its slightly vibrating surface. There was tension in the air. I slid the door open and stepped into the living room, where I could hear rapid footfalls from the second floor. Kristen came running down. "No, David, I'm not going to that shithole place of yours. It is out in the middle of nowhere, and I don't know any of them." Kristen walked frantically into the kitchen as she continued to shout at David. David was halfway down the stairs when he quickly acknowledged me, then continued with my sister. "I know them. They're my boys, damn it, and don't you insult them, you skank." My foot kicked a remote on the ground, and I leaned over to pick it up. I pressed the power button, and the television screen flickered to life. It'd be a good distraction, I thought, and sat down on the couch with the remote in hand. It slowly turned the volume to 0 so I could better hear the argument. "Why the hell don't we ever do anything together, alone?" Kristen's voice was projected at ear-screeching levels. "Like what? I mean, yeah, we can do something alone," David said aloud. while his mind dreaded the anticipation of her saying anything about seeing a movie. Kristen drew close to him, and their words grew dim, but the open corridor echoed their whispers faintly. I just want it to be you and me and not all those other guys. You get too distracted with them, I could hear my sister say as I leaned back on the couch, trying to position my ear correctly. Alright, fine, we'll do that, just you and me, David conformed, as 1,000 spiraling thoughts fabricated ideas that all involved a single conclusion. Drinks? He asked. At this hour, David? No. Kristen began, raising her voice again. I said drinks. That could be water, you twisted woman. I'm not the twisted one, Kristen shouted as she hardly knew the truth in her own words. I stepped out into the corridor. Can you quiet down a bit? I asked, looking to cut their sickening modernized display of romance, though I truthfully preferred to hear what they were saying. Derek, don't start. Kristen lifted her hand about face height as though to signify the stop sign. I could see the back of David, who rummaged through cabinets to find where the glass cups were. I'm just asking, I argued back. And I'm asking you to not start anything, alright? I've had enough of you today. She firmly rested a fist on her hip. While Kristen was preoccupied with me, I continued to look past her while David filled 2 cups of water, reached for something in his back pocket, and looked over his shoulder at us. When he saw me watching, he stopped what he was doing. My sight was locked on him. While Kristen stood staring into my face, waiting for my acknowledgement, I shifted my sight to her and shook my head in confusion, as I had nearly forgot about our conversation. Fine, I shouted in defiance, feeling as though it fit nicely as a concluding piece to our verbal fight. David rammed his fist back into his pocket and pulled out an empty palm. He proceeded to lean on the countertop and sipped away at a glass of water as though watching a drama unfolding before him. Not wanting his actions to escape my sight, I pushed past my sister as though I urgently wanted to reach the kitchen. I crossed the front of David without care and grabbed a glass of water for myself. So, you want to stay here? Or, David asked Kristen, trying to tie her back into their previous conversation. I don't know, David. He got me going. I think you two should see a movie, I said aloud, reading the very thing from David's mind he did not want to happen, and laughed silently to myself as I felt his mind recoil at my words. Derek! Kristen began to yell partway through my sentence, as she was expecting a smart-ass remark. David's back stiffened at the sound of my suggestion, but he did not turn to look at me. Instead, he looked forward at Kristen as though nothing was ever spoken. We could just stay here and come up with something, he said in a quiet voice, as though to exclude me from the conversation. Kristen drew up close and began playing with the front end of his shirt. Yeah, that sounds good, I guess, she said in a fragile, feminine tone, which was a clear contradiction to who she really was. Let's go to your room, David suggested, as his mind screamed the same profound idea again and again throughout the room. The two smiled at one another, and both were about to get up and go off upstairs when I was forced to think fast. What are you going to do? I said innocently. Kristen cocked her head in a long and exaggerated motion before looking at me with rolling eyes. Derek, just shut up. Go play outside or something. I sighed and pushed past the two as though I was going up for the front door. David's dark desires were released into the air again. I turned sharply on my heels. Is it the thing David said last night? What thing? Kristen said, half hanging off of David with a look of annoyance on her face. Don't you say a thing, you twerp, was seen in his eyes as David's mind lashed out frantically in defense. I am going to tell her everything. Maybe we should go somewhere else, David began talking to Kristen, who was busy focusing on me, expecting me to say more. What is he talking about, David? Kristen asked him, trying to pull away. No, nothing. I don't know, he's a fucking kid. And I remember everything you told me that night. David's head shot in my direction. He was growing infuriated. His heart rate spiked. It was everything he planned for, everything he had promised himself, and it was all seconds from being ruined. I was at the heart of his turmoil, and I finally knew how to strike back at him. I took a few steps forward. I was unable to recall the precise words David had used on that night, nor did I understand any of it enough to be able to explain it to Kristen, but I didn't need to do any of that. David knew it all, and I could use him to formulate the words, and his inner thoughts unfurled before me. I did not have to speak the wretched words, for I doubt I'd even forgive myself, nor would I ever be able to explain it to Kristen. Half the words would have been unfamiliar to my tongue, and the sound of them would have brought me to my knees. I begged the forgiveness of any watching higher power as I forced David's mind to project a convincing image of myself, relaying his very thoughts into the words of his choice. His inner desires stood before him in my image, convicting him of the crimes yet to be committed, It was a terrible thing I was giving into, but it must be done, and Kristen would be spared from its wretched echo. What David then saw was the evocation of an image, the conjuration of his desires, but it was all turned against him. His mind attacked itself, as I had suggested it to do. He heard me utter his thoughts. I will rape and I will ravage every part of you. I will make it harder for every day you made me wait, for every delay that was ever caused. I will tear your virginity out of the lifeless carcass that will lay before me, and the greatest thing of it all is you won't remember a thing. In his eyes I stepped forth to my sister and uttered the terrible words in sync with his own mental desires. With every sentence finished, David flinched at its accuracy, was stunned by its precision, and angered by its exposure. His aggression reached its height, and at that moment he vouched that he would do everything to stop me. I encouraged his anger. Kristen pried herself away from David as she looked back at the two of us who still stared intently at one another. I was still and remained unmoved. While David's chest respired rapidly with the growing intensity of his beating heart, his lip curled and his teeth was revealed as anguish and hatred spread across its surface. While the tension in my body diminished and I became weakened, my limbs went limp, and I slowly sunk to the ground as the power of the projection slowly drained my body to depletion. My eyes were glazed over as they no longer looked into the world before me. My sister backed up in fear. She did not know the dialogue that I spoke, or anything that has been exchanged between us, nor did she hear or see any action beyond the few steps I took in approaching him. But what she did see was that David's anger was but moments from climaxing. David kicked off from the dining room counter he was leaning up against and ran across the ground between him and I, in but a blink of an eye. His arms were outstretched before him as his fingers wrapped around my throat and lifted my body into the air. The last thing I had felt was the concussive slam of my back against the wall as my conscience quickly deceased. David backed up, immediately alleviated from the impregnant drives to kill that I had indirectly stirred within him. As my conscious mind had vanished in his assault, so did my influence in his thoughts. Fear spread across his face as he looked down at me in the rag doll form I had taken. He stepped back, all the way back, until he retraced every step he had taken on his way to strangling me. His back was to the counter. My sister let out a terrible scream as she looked down at me and ran over to my limp body with the look of death in her eyes. She clawed at my face and shook my body as though she could snap me out of my lifeless state I was in, before begging on her knees to a God that did not exist, asking for him to return me. I was there, but my body was not, and I looked out at David as he stared back into the void behind my dying eyes. Though I was unrestrained by any means, I could not move, for the look upon my sister's face had brought a longing sorrow to my form. Her regret and her tears tore away at the essence that had made up everything of who I was. I was forgiving every aspect of my life, every emotion I had, just to look away from her pain. David broke his sight from me, and looked at the back of Kristen, who curled over my limp form as her strength had left her legs in that dreadful moment. She forgot he was there, as all she knew was that her brother was dying before her. In all his cowardice, David turned his head to look at the side door, and I felt his mind leap in its direction. I could not allow him to escape. After being expelled from my body, I passed through my sister and flowed through the endless sea of despair. Conflicting emotions crashed into one another, causing violent cracks of lightning and thundering storms in the emptiness of my house. A fleeting form was before me, desperately wishing escape as its soul flickered in dim light like a dying flame. I grabbed a hold of the fearful being and pulled it into a swamp of dismay, entombing its conscience in the rending cowls of redemption. Judgment would not go undelivered. The loud, crashing sound of glass was heard from behind her, and Kristen shot up to her feet. Violent trembles shivered through her limbs as her tear-soaked face looked behind her in the direction of the noise. She was gnawing on the tips of her fingers as she took tiny, fearful steps towards the kitchen to investigate the disturbance. She fell to her knees a second time in shrieking terror when she saw David's body sprawled onto the kitchen floor, bleeding from the wounds cut by the shattered glass that he had dropped in his violent crash to the floor. I wished dearly that I did not have to leave her at such a vital moment.